Tonight's weather again showing storm moving northward, bringing gusty winds and rain into the central Aleutians. Snow and blowing snow push into the Pribilof Islands. And some lingering, diminishing light snow showers here over the southwest or western interior areas, but clearing out as well. Some snow and blowing snow eastern Arctic coast, but that condition improving tonight. And lows in the interior, central interior, anywhere from 45 to 55 degrees below zero. And snow becomes heavy at times for the northern panhandle with periods of rain to the south. And that begins to lighten up on Thursday as that front edges eastward there. And looking at rain or snow, most areas with snow from, say, Juneau, maybe Petersburg, northward up to Haines. Clear and cold and still some windy areas like Resurrection Bay here and the North Gulf Coast areas. Otherwise, again, below zero, southern Alaska, well below zero in the interior to the Arctic coast. And warmer weather coming up into the Bering Sea here with this system, with rain change or snow changing to rain for the Pribilof Islands with gale force winds in advance of that. Less wind, though, as that front weakens and really elongates out with a weak low here developing over the Alaska Peninsula. So light snow along the southwest coast. Warm and windy out over the Aleutians, cold and dry in the interior, chance of snow eastern Arctic coast, and snow showers for the panhandle. Coastal water forecasts, northwest winds 30 to 35 knots there for Thursday for the southern coast of the panhandle, and diminishing as you head north here, northwest 20 to 25 knots on the central coast, and north 20 to 25 knots for the north coast. North winds 30 knots, Lynn Canal 20 knots out of the north for Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait. Southeast winds at 20 knots, 25 knots. Let's see. Yeah, 25 knots. Seas 6 feet. And then for Friday, we've got west to northwest winds at 25 knots for the south coast. And, or actually, let's call it west 20 to 25 knots for the south coast. Northwest there along Prince of Wales Island. East-northeast, 15 to 20 knots on the north coast. Lynn Canal is north at 30 knots, Stevens Passage north at 20 knots, and north winds 20 knots also for Clarence Strait. And for the Prince William Sound area, tomorrow north winds 20 knots, north to northeast winds, north to northwest winds 20 to 25 knots for the North Gulf Coast, northwest 25, Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, Cook Inlet north to northeast at 15 knots. Outlook for Friday, Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 10 to 25 knots. Northeast at about 30 knots for Kamishak Bay, otherwise north 25 for the Barren Islands, and western North Gulf Coast, northeast 20 to 30 knot winds for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound, not too bad, northeast winds 15 knots, seas 3 feet. Kodiak Island, northwest winds 20 knots for the day on Thursday. Bristol Bay, northeast at 15 knots, and the Alaska Peninsula south to southeast winds 25 knots. And then for Friday, the Alaska Peninsula south winds at 30 knots, otherwise northeast at 20 knots for Bristol Bay, and north to northeast winds 15 to 25 knots for Kodiak. Eastern Aleutians, gale warnings tomorrow, southeast winds 40 knots. Adak and Atka, south to southwest winds 30 to 35 knots, and 25 to 40 knot winds from the west for the western Aleutians. And for Friday, we've got south to southeast winds 40 to 45 knots for the western Aleutians, Adak and Atka southeast at 45, and gale warnings continue for the eastern Aleutians for south to southeast winds 35 to 45 knots. Southwest coast tomorrow, northeast winds 20 knots. Northeast 20 also for St. Lawrence Island, northeast 15 for the Norton Sound area. Storm warnings here for St. Matthew Island, east winds 50 knots, east winds 40 knots for the Pribilof Islands. And then for Friday, southeast winds 35 knots there for St. Paul and St. George. Storm warnings continue, St. Matthew Island, northeasterlies at 50 knots, southeast 30 knots there for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, east winds at 30 knots, and also brisk wind advisories there for Norton Sound, northeast at 25. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, west winds coming down from what they were today and will be tonight, 20 to 25 knots. and northwest 15 for the central coast, western Arctic coast, west winds 10 to 15 knots, and the Chukchi Sea northwest at 15. And for Friday, here from Cape Lisburne down to Wales, north winds 10 to 15 knots. Light westerlies for the western Arctic coast and west at 15 for the central coast. Brisk wind advisories, eastern Beaufort Sea coast for those west winds at 25 to 30 knots.